Cześć, hello, witam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matalevich. I was always quite fascinated with genealogy from a young age, and for years now have been combing through archives, searching online sources, and traveling to Poland in pursuit of details about the lives of my ancestors. For my entire life, something always drove me to pursue it, and this was always joined with a desire to celebrate the Polish heritage I discovered along with it as well. To this end, the past few years I've worked with a researcher and friend living in Poland who has helped me immensely by locating records stretching back well into the 18th century. At one point, he sent me a batch of records spanning the decades of the mid-1800s. Although he would send me translations, I would look through the scans of the actual documents themselves, trying to decipher the archaic script for any sign of familiarity. The thrill at seeing a surname in print, and even better a signature, always made the document and the person behind it more real. As I had worked backwards from the immigrants of the early 1900s, I had become accustomed to seeing records written in Russian Cyrillic, of which I had little knowledge. Any genealogist knows that understanding historical geography can be critical in contextualizing their search, and I had already learned that my family had primarily lived in the Russian section of Poland. Finding vital records written in Russian, then, was not at all surprising. However, as I moved from one of these documents dated 1865 to one dated 1861, there was a sudden and noticeable shift in the text. The alphabet was familiar, and suddenly, to my astonishment, I could actually make it out clearly. These vital records were written in Polish. Why then was there a change? Poland had ceased to exist as a political entity 7 years prior, so I figured so had language in official documents. After consulting the Polish historical timeline, I found my answer. Only one event of note occurred in our history during this period to explain why this change would have happened. It, like so many events in Polish history, was a story of tragedy and loss, of suffering and struggle, yet one that would prove to be a source of pride and inspiration, and one that in its obscurity, I believe deserves more recognition in the conscience of American Polonia. Even if you were half asleep through much of your general history classes, odds are that if you were asked to name any historical event that occurred in the 1860s, your answer would be the American Civil War. This great cataclysm is impossible to ignore in understanding the political and social fabric of our country, and its ramifications are still very much felt today. The greatness and tragedy of Abraham Lincoln, the blue and the gray, Generals Grant and Lee, Gettysburg, and the like, are part of even rudimentary historical knowledge. This has been reinforced in popular culture through film and literature, and after all, why wouldn't it be? The drama of epic battle scenes in a bid to support a heroic cause of freedom, combined with tales of love and loss woven in between, seize our collective imaginations as no fiction can. The vast majority of our Polish ancestors immigrated late in the 19th and into the early 20th century in the decades following the American Civil War, and so our participation in its events was rather rare. Yet during this same period, another struggle, in many ways no different in its righteousness and sacrifice, and certainly similar in its scope, was playing out right before their very eyes. In what was to become known as the January Uprising of 1863, in Polish, Powstanie Styczniowe, years of agitation at foreign rule culminated the armed attempt to re-establish the independence of Poland. This struggle, lasting nearly 2 years, was embedded with a promise and a dream that was to become central to the heart of every freedom-loving Pole in the last century, and one that would be careless and neglect today. But let's back up for a minute, for I fear I might be neglecting some context. There are many people, even those who are Polish-American, that are surprised that the familiar square shape of Poland that we see reproduced on Polish pride t-shirts, magnets, keychains, etc., is not one that represents the territorial borders for most of its existence. Although you may have heard the statistic that at one point Poland was the largest country in Europe, for 123 years, the country had no borders at all. In what is known as the Partition of Poland, partition meaning to divide, and one of the most tragic episodes of an era that historians like to classify as the Age of Enlightenment, Poland was picked apart piece by piece in the late 1700s by its powerful neighbors, Austria, Prussia, which is today modern Germany, and Russia. The reasons for this are complicated and are a topic perhaps for a future episode. But for our discussion today, we are dealing with a time when a once powerful nation, with centuries of history, culture, and pride, all but vanished from the atlases of Europe. It wouldn't be until 1917 that the country would officially reappear. Socially, the Poland of the time's partition was one that was stratified into various classes, as it had been more or less for centuries. At the top were the landed nobility, called szlachta in Polish. Unlike Western European nobility, there were no established titles such as dukes, earls, or barons, as they were all technically equal. However, they did unofficially separate themselves by the amount of property they owned, with the so-called magnate landowners at the very top, and a lesser nobility existing beneath them in a large middle class. The surnames of magnate families, Radziwiłł, Czartoryski, and Sapieha, among others, feature prominently in the narratives of Polish and European history right up into our modern day. Historically, the monarchy of Poland had been an elected one, not hereditary, and these were the powerful people who cast the votes for the king. Fighting among themselves for influence and power, their radical self-interest was to be a chief cause of Poland's partition, and meant that they were nearly constantly at odds with each other, and often in the pay of some foreign power. However, the one thing that was agreed upon universally by the szlachta was that below them were located the vast numbers of landless peasants who worked the land or in their various trades supporting the great estates across the country. Our modern idea of nationality was also not one that was particularly understood, especially by the peasants. There were various local languages and dialects, some of which were to emerge in the 20th century into the nations of modern Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. These conflicting interests and a lack of cohesion meant that the peasant participation in the uprising was very fractured. What had united Poland in theory had been its grand history and a religion that gave it a sense of purpose and existence. Further, Polish served as the official language of state, education, and public life. Yet the glories that Poland enjoyed in the 16th and 17th centuries were being forsaken in a nation that was in decline on the world stage. Sensing this weakness, the hungry imperial wolves descended on Poland's territory, and the country was gradually divided in the late 18th century. In a last grasp for freedom, and spurred on by the same principles that inspired the American Revolution, Poland enacted a democratic constitution on the eve of its final partition. For her neighbors, this presented a great threat that had to be neutralized and fast. The challenge to the absolute power of a czar or emperor grew very real by the day. Emperor Joseph II of Austria had only to recall the fate of his younger sister, Marie Antoinette, for an all-too reminder of what was at stake. But a people steeped in traditions and a language centuries old was not one that would go quietly into submission. This was to materialize in a series of armed rebellions and political attempts at re-establishment, starting as early as the Napoleonic Wars. Unfortunately, the pattern of these insurgencies was the gaining of some initial success, but an ultimate end in failure. In the wake of one of these failed uprisings in November of 1831, Poland had settled into an uneasy quiet, with tensions always simmering beneath the surface. Although this rebellion had been quelled, Polish patriots agitated, waiting for the golden opportunity when they could revolt again. Likewise, the informal education at home and in church meant that an entire generation was instilled with a renewed sense of patriotic duty. This opportunity seemed to appear in the wake of the Russian loss in the Crimean War of the 1850s. In a parallel of current events, the empire's energies had become bogged down in a war over Crimea with the West and endured severe losses. The Russian internal security network had always existed in a state of constant paranoia at the possibility of another Polish uprising. In the lead up to 1863, murmurs of imminent unrest caused the regional governor to institute a massive draft of young men in Poland into the imperial army in order to deplete it of any potential recruits. This move, however, caused the exact opposite effect, as the underground network that had been planning a rebellion was spurred into action. What ensued was the largest and longest popular uprising in Poland's history. Led mostly by members of the lesser nobility and the clergy, the members of the uprising took up arms all over Poland in the cause of freedom. In addition to these, large numbers of women and foreign fighters participated alongside native Poles in the open revolt that was to cover virtually the entire area of Russian-held Poland and Lithuania. Though relatively well organized with a full underground government, the draft had forced the uprising leaders to move up their timeline and act earlier than planned. Winter was a poor time to begin a rebellion, and the participants lacked greatly in supplies, arms, and ammunition. For 2 years, the elements of the uprising waged an open war against the Russian occupiers, with some battlefield successes and hundreds of skirmishes. However, in the wake of increasing Russian reinforcements, this eventually fell into mostly guerrilla warfare. Moving in and out of dense forests, of which they had in-depth knowledge, the fighters did their best to harass the imperial troops sent to eliminate them. Why, then, do we seldom hear about this effort of oppressed Poles to win back their country? Well, the reason is probably because history is written by the victors. International politics had a great effect on Western European attitude towards the rebels. Although there was sympathy in many circles, after the bloody Crimean War, few were willing to enter all-out conflict so soon for the sake of little old Poland. The Russian government labeled the uprising as an internal matter, effectively warning off any other power against intervention. Without foreign support to lend pressure on Russia, the uprising was effectively doomed, as the empire soon brought its full strength to bear on the rebels. When Poland was finally pacified toward the end of 1864, the administrative reaction of the imperial government was brutal. Seeking to especially punish the Szlachta and clergy for their disobedience, many were brutally dealt with and their properties confiscated. In a culture where land made all the difference in status, this would have been humiliation enough, yet this paled in comparison to the sentences carried out by vengeful Russian administrators. In an eerie foreshadowing of 20th century crimes, hundreds of rebels were tortured, executed, or deported to Siberia, to say nothing of the outright slaughter and destruction of whole villages in reprisal. Churches and monasteries were closed, and Russia became the language of instruction in schools, as well as in all administration and civil documents. State-sponsored Orthodox churches were built all over Poland. The territory was fully incorporated into the empire, divided into provinces with a military governor-general appointed to oversee them. The place, formerly known as Poland, was in effect a police state, now referred to officially as the Przemyślński Kraj, the country by the Wisła River. All that was central to Polish identity and its traditional customs and language was essentially outlawed. Those who weren't caught by the Russians fled into exile abroad. The valiant efforts of the uprising were initially lauded in foreign newspapers, art, and literature, but would gradually be forgotten and in some cases deliberately suppressed. In the initial draft of his famous novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne cast Captain Nemo as an exiled Polish noble whose family, like many in real life, had been brutally murdered during the uprising. This was reflected in Nemo's sense of cynicism to the world and rebellion against it. However, due to France's recent alliance with Russia at the time of its publication, it was worried that to include this detail would harm international relations, and so the details were stricken from its final publication. So you may now be wondering what the point may be in recalling the story of this Polish failed uprising, one that usually gains, if any, merely a passing mention in most general history. what did it all mean? Furthermore, what could it possibly mean to us a century and a half later? In 2017, I had made a trip to Poland to do some family research with my friend. My lack of fluency was a handicap, and his experience in such matters ensured that I am not still wandering the country, totally lost. In addition to informative, this trip would prove to be a remarkable adventure. In the course of our travels, we located living cousins from distant ancestors long since passed, ones that had been separated from connection by a century, 2 world wars, and 4,000 miles of land and sea. During one of these amazing days of reconnection, I was fortunate that one of my newfound cousins had been interested in family history as well, and had not only done some research of his own, but was still in possession of our ancestral land on the shore of the stunning Lake Vigre in northeastern Poland. I spent a beautiful autumn evening with these newly discovered cousins, enjoying the Polish staples of hospitality, food, and vodka. While my cousins spun yards about our ancestry, I would often be lost in the intricacies of the language in which I was still rudimentary at best, instead relying on my friend for translation. During one of these tales, however, I snapped to attention when he mentioned familiar words, powstanie styczniowe. To my amazement, amongst the well-known stories that I had heard of the challenges of immigration from my grandparents, would now be added one of ancestors I had never heard of, who had fought and lost nearly everything in this failed bid for Polish independence in 1863. A footnote in history was instantly transformed into a central part of my own story that riveted me to a time and place that could no longer be labeled foreign. This sudden perspective helped me to recognize something I had never thought of. Why had my family been so adamant about keeping their Polish culture alive and flourishing here in the US, even though we had so long been physically separated from Polish soil? Why had the traditions, customs, and language been kept going, when logically it should have dissolved in the melting pot of American culture? What I was left to conclude was that though our participation in the January Uprising had been lost in the story of immigration and struggle here in the States, the ideals and goal of the events permeated through generations. Even though this is a personal example, stories such as mine are no doubt shared by many of us in the Polish community here in the United States, and one that is perhaps part of your own unknown family history. I've found that the intensity of spirit and the cultural pride that is felt in the Polish community is not something that occurs in just one generation. The self-knowledge that comes from interacting with our family's past can be very real. Yet even if our direct ancestors were not on the front lines of the 1863 January Uprising, a kindred spirit is found in the Polish saying, "Wszyscy Polacy to jedna rodzina." Everyone that is Polish is part of one family. The intricacies of time and space between the immigrant generation and our own are ones that may have lent themselves to the loss of a knowledge and the personal connection to the events of Polish history that predate recent memory. The lessons of history, particularly in our own families, are ones that might reveal more about us than we even realize. Also, to put it into perspective, for the generation that immigrated around the turn of the 20th century, the events of the uprising had occurred only about 30 to 40 years prior, which was roughly the same timetable that separates you from the Vietnam or Persian Gulf Wars. The brutal measures of the Russian Empire to destroy Polish identity in the wake of the uprising fell short when pitted against the idea of Poland in the heart of its people. Although there was certainly a terrible wound inflicted on Poland, and in so many ways she would never be the same, the fact that there was no public safe haven for the language, customs, and traditions didn't keep Poland from living on in some way. This sense of nationality was then carried across the Atlantic in the Polish diaspora, where the seed of Polish identity was planted and blossomed in places like right here in Camden, New Jersey. Limited only by the monetary amount of contributions to their construction, the spires of Polish cathedral-style ethnic parishes reached up to heaven, bypassing the heights of smokestacks and industrialized cities, as immigrant communities around them, with their shops, bakeries, benevolent associations, and organizations, flourished. Yet the grandeur of these communities was nothing compared to having it resurrected in the soil of the homeland. Large numbers of Polish immigrants even returned to build the country after the First World War, once Poland had regained its independence. However, in one of history's bitter ironies, Poland's struggle against foreign domination was far from over, as this momentary light of independence was to be once again and even more brutally tested during a Second World War, followed by a half-century of communist oppression. The pain of these events is inherited by Polonia, whether we are aware of our ancestors in the January Uprising or not. It was the defining national event that would have been at the forefront of their consciences when they immigrated. The more we make ourselves aware of their worldview, the more it will help us to understand why places such as St. Joe's and Camden still stand. Their mortar is strengthened by the metaphorical blood of struggle and resilience that has become the hallmark of Poles around the world and across the centuries. January's Polish saint of the month is Saint Raphael Kalinowski. In Polish, Święty Rafał Kalinowski. His feast day is November 19th, and he lived from September 1st, 1835 to November 15th, 1907. Raphael was born Józef Kalinowski in modern-day Vilnius, Lithuania, the son of a noble Szlachta family. His mother died within a few months of his birth, and his father, a professor of mathematics, remarried twice. Although he was intelligent and well educated in the Polish noble tradition, his career options were limited by the Russian authorities who controlled this section of the country during the time of the partitions. Starting in 1853, he served in the Imperial Russian Army as an engineer, rising to the rank of captain. However, he resigned his commission to join in the unsuccessful January Uprising of 1863 against the Russian occupiers, and served as Ministry of War in the cabinet. After the uprising was squashed, he was captured and sentenced to death. However, due to intense pleading from friends and relatives, his sentence was commuted to exile in Siberia, where he spent nearly 10 years. During this time of struggle, he was sustained by the faith of his youth and became a spiritual leader among the other prisoners. Exiled from Lithuania, he first moved to Paris, where he became a tutor to the sickly young prince August Czartoryski. Through Raphael's inspiration, the prince later became a priest and was himself beatified in 2004. Continually drawn to a greater experience of faith, he was moved to join the Discalced Carmelites and was ordained in the town of Czerna outside of Kraków in 1882, taking the name Raphael of St. Joseph. His reputation for sanctity and good works became widely known. As the monasteries of his order had been suppressed and confiscated following the uprising, Raphael helped re-establish the order's presence by founding many monasteries across modern-day Poland and Ukraine, including the town of Wadowice. He served as a profound spiritual father and spiritual director to Catholics and Orthodox alike. After his death from tuberculosis in 1907, such was his fame for holiness that pieces of the plaster from his original tomb were broken off by pilgrims. A native of Wadowice, a young Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II, was greatly inspired by the life of Raphael, revering him as something of a boyhood hero. Later as pontiff, he presided over Raphael's beatification in 1983 and his canonization in 1991. Saint Raphael is venerated as the patron of soldiers and officers of Poland and Siberian exiles. Relics. From its earliest existence, the Church has held sacred the practice of relic veneration and enshrinement. This practice has often been attacked as morbid at best, idol worship, and exploitative at worst. Yet the practice of seeking relics of saints has been one that can be understood in our desire to connect with the people and places on earth that have touched those closest to heaven. In our very own St. Joseph's Church, Dozens of first-class relics, meaning that they are physical pieces of saints, have been enshrined on our altar rail, in addition to those enclosed within our historic altar stones located on the main and side altars. This practice goes back to the ancient tradition of the early church, in which masses were said in Roman catacombs above the tombs of martyrs. In much the same way, early pilgrims to the tomb of St. Raphael Kalinowski virtually destroyed the plaster surrounding it in an effort to gain a closeness to the saint by breaking off pieces as souvenirs. While this practice can seem very strange to those outside of the church, everyone can relate to the thrill of obtaining an autograph, or even better, catching a foul ball at a baseball game from their favorite player. Millions visit historic sites and museums every year to learn and feel a connection with a period of history or a person that enthralls them. Then there are those who wait hours to glimpse the view of a celebrity, politician, or royal. Why then does the practice of enshrining relics of those who are known to be so in contact with the divine here on earth surprise us? During his life, St. Raphael Kalinowski was an amazing person indeed, a national hero, but also one who in his holiness and zeal was recognized as being uniquely in touch with the teachings of the gospel. Raphael saw in his military and religious life the ability to change the hearts of people for good. Like all of our heroes, those who sought him out, whether it was through physically or spiritual means, wanted to gain an interaction with a person they saw as special. With this connection, they recognized great things could happen. As the amazing life of St. John Paul II would later show, this was certainly possible. Reflection questions. Who are the heroes in my life? What qualities do they emulate that I admire? How can I recognize the way I seek them out with how I should seek out the ultimate heroes? St. Raphael's actions inspired countless others to greater holiness, as in the example of St. John Paul II. We all have people who look to us as examples. How do my actions work to inspire those that may look up to me? Would I want others to follow my example? If not, how could I change to make this so? Throughout his life, St. Raphael was able to influence and lead others from every level of society to conversion. How can I see in his life ways of strengthening my identities, be it Polish, Catholic, American, spouse, parent, or child? We hope that you enjoyed our podcast today on the Polish January Uprising and St. Raphael Kalinowski. If our topic inspired you to learn more about your personal family history, there are various ways of doing so. The Polish Genealogical Society of America, based in Chicago, can provide specific resources and great general material on helping your search. Close at home, many local genealogical and historical societies can also help with your research, especially the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. A list of these locations, as well as links to videos and other resources, will be listed on our Facebook page. As usual, if you would like a chance to see our historic St. Joseph's Church in person outside of our normal Sunday Mass schedule, you will have an opportunity on January 11th, as the St. Joseph History Society will be conducting their usual tours of the church starting at 2:00 p.m. Please email the History Society at stjhistory@yahoo.com with church tours in the subject line to sign up, or see the apostolate website or bulletin for more information. The mission of our apostolate is to celebrate and share our Polish and Catholic traditions across our southern New Jersey diocese and beyond. We do this throughout the year by hosting cultural programs and tours of the historic church, as well as every Sunday at our 10 o'clock bilingual Polish-English Mass with Polish music and associated traditions. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and if you like what you hear, kindly leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you listen to. You can also always drop us a line at pierogideprayer@gmail.com. Until next time, saute some pierogi and go sit with a saint. Dziękujemy.